Hey there, I'm Gus, and welcome to another episode of Mind Liberty, where we break down the complex issues facing the nation, and most importantly, you. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that affects everyone, whether you're paying attention or not: America's rapidly growing national debt. Now, I know what you're thinking. Debt, fiscal deficits, trillions of dollars in liabilities. Sounds like a problem for the future, right? But here's the thing. This is no longer just a problem for politicians in Washington or economists on Wall Street. This is a here and now issue, and it's far bigger than most people realize. It's not just about numbers on a balance sheet. This debt explosion could redefine America's role in the world, your ability to buy a home, secure a job, and plan for your future. Stay with me here, because this is critical. America's national debt has surpassed $34 trillion. Just let that sink in for a moment. That's a number with 12 zeros behind it. Every day we're piling on another billion in debt. In fact, the national debt is growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Now, it's easy to think of that as an abstract figure, but that $34 trillion impacts you in ways you might not even realize, from the cost of groceries to the value of the dollar in your pocket. And here's where it gets alarming. The Senate itself has declared this situation a national security threat. Imagine that. Our fiscal mismanagement is no longer just about economics. It's about security. That means we're entering territory where the very foundation of American stability, both economically and politically, is at risk. Today, we're going to explore how we got here, what's being done about it, or not being done, and what the potential fallout could be. And trust me, this isn't just doom and gloom. By the end of this episode, I'll share some key insights on what we as individuals can do to prepare for the uncertainty ahead. You're going to want to stick around for that. Okay, so let's talk numbers. In 2023 alone, the US government spent over $1 trillion just on interest payments for the debt. Yeah, you heard that right. $1 trillion just to pay the interest on what we already owe. And here's where it gets worse. This isn't a one-time deal. With interest rates rising, the cost of servicing our debt is only going to increase. Think about it. Every single year, a larger and larger portion of the federal budget goes just toward interest payments. That's money that could be going toward healthcare, education, infrastructure, but instead, it's simply vanishing into the black hole of national debt. Now, we can talk all day about federal budgets and deficits, but let's bring this closer to home. Imagine this scenario. You've got your own household budget. You have a mortgage, maybe student loans, maybe even some credit card. But what if, every year, a bigger and bigger chunk of your income just went toward paying off interest, without touching the principal? You're not paying down your debt, you're barely keeping your head above water. Now multiply that by trillions of dollars, and that's exactly where the US government finds itself. We're refinancing this massive debt year after year with no end in sight. And a huge portion of that debt is tied to short-term treasury bills, so we're not even locking in low interest rates for the long term. Every time we refinance, we're exposing ourselves to higher and higher costs. It's like floating your mortgage on an adjustable rate, and each adjustment gets more painful. Let's talk about something that's probably crossed your mind by now: inflation. We've all been feeling it, right? Rising prices at the pump, higher grocery bills, everything feels more expensive. Well, here's the connection you might not have considered. Inflation is one way governments, intentionally or unintentionally, deal with debt. By inflating the currency, you make each dollar worth less, which, in theory, makes it easier to pay off debt. But the problem is, inflation hits the average American harder than anyone else. Your paycheck doesn't stretch as far, and your savings lose value. So while the government might see inflation as a way to ease its debt burden, it's you who ends up paying the price. But inflation isn't the only risk. Imagine what happens when, and it's really more of a when than an if, a recession hits. The government's tax revenues fall off a cliff because people aren't making as much money, businesses aren't profitable, and suddenly there's even less cash coming in to pay down that massive debt. At the same time, government spending tends to go up during recessions, with more money needed for unemployment benefits, stimulus programs, and other safety nets. You see the problem, right? Less revenue, more spending, and an already unsustainable deficit. It's a vicious cycle. Here's something else to think about: the Federal Reserve. It used to be one of the biggest buyers of US debt. Whenever the government needed to borrow money, the Fed was there, buying up treasury bills and bonds to keep things moving. But here's the thing. The Fed's not buying anymore. In fact, they're selling off their existing holdings. That's like having a safety net pulled out from under you while you're already walking a tightrope. So, who's buying all this debt now? Well, that's another scary part of the story. Foreign investors, domestic institutions, and even individual Americans are starting to lose confidence in US debt. And when confidence wanes, interest rates go up, and the whole cycle worsens. Alright, I know this is a lot to take in. It sounds overwhelming because it is overwhelming, but that's exactly why we need to talk about it. This isn't just a problem for politicians in Washington to figure out. This affects every single one of us. And as we continue, I want to get into the ways this could reshape the global economy, how the dominance of the US dollar is being challenged, and what the alternatives are. Stick around, because in just a bit, I'm going to break down some scenarios that no one seems to be talking about, but you need to be aware of. Plus, we'll get into the personal impact, what this means for your money, your job, and your future. Now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. For decades, the US dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency. Countries around the world hold their savings in dollars, they trade in dollars, and they buy US debt because it's seen as safe. But what happens when people and countries start to question that safety? We're already seeing signs of this. Countries like China and Russia are pushing for alternatives to the dollar. The euro, the yuan, and even digital currencies are emerging as potential competitors. And once that trust in the dollar starts to waver, the US could lose one of its most powerful economic weapons, its ability to borrow cheaply and reliably from the rest of the world. That's a game changer. Imagine a world where the US has to compete for global investment in the same way smaller economies do. Suddenly, our debt isn't just an internal problem, it's a global one. And here's where things get really critical. If the US dollar loses its status as the world's go-to currency, the cost of borrowing for the US skyrockets. We're talking about significantly higher interest rates that could ripple through the entire economy. Everything from mortgages to car loans would get more expensive. Investment would dry up. And in the worst-case scenario, we could see a full-blown financial crisis, one that makes 2008 look like a minor hiccup. But let's not jump too far ahead just yet. It's important to understand that this isn't a guaranteed outcome. The US still holds a lot of power on the global stage. Our military, our tech dominance, our innovations, they all play a role in keeping the dollar strong. But the cracks in the system are starting to show, and unless we address them head-on, the consequences could be severe. Alright, you're still with me, right? Good, because up next we're going to dig into the solutions. What could the US government do to get us out of this fiscal mess? Is there a way to reduce the debt without crippling the economy or sacrificing the future of millions of Americans? Don't go anywhere. We're just getting started. So, we've laid out the problem. America's mounting debt, rising interest payments, inflation, recession risks, and the potential fallout of the US dollar losing its grip as the global reserve currency. But the big question on everyone's mind is this: what can be done about it? The truth is, the solutions are tough. We're not talking about a quick fix or a band-aid solution here. There's no magic wand that can erase trillions of dollars in debt overnight. But we also can't just sit back and let things unravel. The government has a few tools in its toolbox, and while none of them are perfect, they could at least buy us some time, or better yet, set us on a path toward real recovery. First up, let's talk about what economists call austerity. Now, austerity is kind of a dirty word in politics, but it basically means tightening the belt, cutting government spending and raising taxes to reduce the deficit. It sounds simple enough, right? Just spend less than you make. But when you apply that logic to a national economy, things get a lot more complicated. Here's why. When the government cuts spending, it often means cutting essential services. Everything from Medicare to defense, education, and infrastructure. These cuts can hit the most vulnerable Americans the hardest. And if taxes go up, it could slow down consumer spending and business investment, which means less growth, fewer jobs, and even lower tax revenues. It's a bit like trying to save your way out of a hole that keeps getting deeper. That doesn't mean austerity is off the table. It's just that it has to be balanced carefully. Some level of spending cuts and tax increases may be necessary to get the debt under control, but if we go too far, too fast, it could lead to economic stagnation or worse, recession. Remember, reducing the debt is important, but not if it means crushing the economy in the process. Okay, so if austerity isn't a silver bullet, what's the alternative? One option is to focus on growth. If the economy grows fast enough, government revenues will increase without the need for drastic spending cuts or tax hikes. Growth generates more jobs, higher incomes, and ultimately more tax revenue to pay down the debt. Sounds great, right? But achieving that kind of growth isn't easy, especially when the economy is already facing headwinds like inflation and global uncertainty. We could invest in infrastructure, education, and technology to drive innovation and productivity, but those investments take time to pay off. It's not an overnight fix, and in the meantime, the debt keeps piling up. But here's a question no one seems to be asking. What if the government isn't really planning to pay off the debt? I know that sounds crazy, but bear with me. Some economists argue that countries like the US don't actually need to pay off their debt in the traditional sense. As long as the economy keeps growing and inflation remains under control, we can keep rolling over the debt, borrowing to pay off existing debt indefinitely. Now, this doesn't mean we can just borrow forever without consequences, but the idea is that as long as the US remains a global superpower with a strong economy and the world's most trusted currency, we can manage the debt without ever needing to pay it off completely. It's more about managing the debt than eliminating it. But here's the risk. That only works if the rest of the world continues to trust the US and the dollar. If that trust falters, everything changes. Interest rates would spike, inflation would soar, and the US could face a full-blown financial crisis. So while it's possible to manage the debt without paying it off, it's a high-wire act. One wrong move, and the whole thing comes crashing down. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. But now, I want to zoom out even further and talk about the global implications of America's debt crisis. You see, when we talk about the US, dollar and debt, we're not just talking about the United States, we're talking about the entire global economy. The US is the world's largest economy, and the dollar is the backbone of global finance. So if the US struggles, the ripple effects are felt worldwide. Think about it this way. When you look at global trade, oil is priced in dollars, international loans are often in dollars, and countries from China to Germany hold massive amounts of US debt. If the value of the dollar starts to decline, or if foreign investors lose confidence in US treasuries, we could see a global financial shift. And this isn't some far-off theoretical idea. It's already starting to happen. Take China, for example. Over the last few years, they've been actively working to reduce their reliance on the US dollar. They're promoting the use of the Chinese yuan in global trade and making deals with other countries to bypass the dollar altogether. Russia is doing the same. They're building alliances and exploring alternatives like cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. Now, none of these alternatives are ready to replace the dollar just yet, but the writing is on the wall. So, here's the big question. What happens if the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency? This is critical because the US has been able to borrow so much and keep interest rates low for one key reason: global demand for dollars. If that demand starts to drop, it's going to get a lot more expensive for the US to borrow. And that's when things start to spiral. Think about it. If the US government has to pay higher interest rates just to borrow money, that means even more of the federal budget will go toward interest payments, leaving less for everything else. Less for healthcare, less for social security, less for defense, less for infrastructure. At the same time, inflation could rise even further, eroding the purchasing power of every dollar you earn. It's a perfect storm, and it's not just theoretical. We're seeing signs of it already. The US dollar's dominance isn't going to disappear overnight, but we're heading down a path where alternatives are emerging. If we don't get the debt under control, we could see a future where the dollar is no longer the undisputed king of global finance. So, where does that leave us? How do we fix this mess before it's too late? Well, one idea that's gaining traction is a combination of fiscal reforms and technological innovation. That might sound like a mouthful, But stay with me because this could be key to solving the debt crisis while maintaining growth. First, let's talk about fiscal reforms. There's no getting around it. We need a smarter approach to taxes and spending. Some economists are calling for targeted reforms that would reduce wasteful spending and close tax loopholes for corporations and the ultra-wealthy. At the same time, they argue we should invest in areas that generate long-term growth, things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. These are the kinds of investments that don't just pay off in terms of better services, but also create jobs, boost productivity, and drive innovation. But here's the kicker. It's not just about cutting spending or raising taxes, it's about making the right investments that lead to sustainable growth. That's how we reduce the debt without crashing the economy. And here's where technology comes in. Let's face it, America has always been at the forefront of innovation. From the Industrial Revolution to the rise of Silicon Valley, our economy has been fueled by technological breakthroughs. And the next wave of innovation, things like artificial intelligence, renewable energy, biotech, could be our ticket out of this fiscal mess. These are the industries of the future, and if the US leads the way, we could see an economic boom that helps to pay down the debt while maintaining our position as a global leader. But, and this is important, none of that will happen unless we get our house in order. Innovation thrives in stable environments. Investors need confidence, businesses need certainty. And right now, that confidence is being shaken by our massive national debt and the uncertainty around how we're going to deal with it. So while innovation holds promise, it's not a guarantee. We have to create the conditions for it to thrive. All right, I promised you earlier that I'd talk about what you can do in the face of all this uncertainty, because let's be real, while the government wrestles with these big, complex problems, we still have to live our lives. We have to pay our bills, plan for retirement, and make sure our families are taken care of. Stick with me here, because in just a minute, I'm going to share some personal strategies that could help you navigate this financial landscape, whether the US solves its debt crisis or not. These are actionable steps you can take to protect your money, your investments, and your future. Okay, so what can you do? First, if you haven't already, it's time to take a hard look at your own finances. I'm talking about budgeting, saving and investing with an eye toward the future. If inflation continues to rise, cash loses value over time. That means your savings need to be in vehicles that can outpace inflation, whether that's real estate, stocks, or other assets. At the same time, keep an eye on interest rates. If you've got debt, whether it's a mortgage, student loans, or credit cards, now's the time to refinance and lock in lower rates if possible. As interest rates go up, borrowing becomes more expensive, and that could hurt you in the long run. Another key strategy, diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially in uncertain economic times. That means spreading out your investments. Don't rely solely on US stocks or bonds. Look at global markets. Consider alternative assets like gold or even digital currencies, and think about how you can protect yourself from the potential fallout of a weakening dollar. Lastly, be mindful of government policies. Pay attention to what's happening with taxes, Social Security, and retirement plans. The government could make changes that directly impact your financial future, so staying informed is crucial. And if you're unsure about your financial plan, don't hesitate to consult a PI. There's no shame in asking for help, especially when the stakes are this high. Look, I know this can all feel a bit overwhelming. The idea that America's national debt could spiral into a full-blown crisis is hard to wrap your head around. But that's why it's so important to understand what's at stake and what we can do to prepare. The debt crisis isn't just a Washington problem. It's an issue that affects every single one of us. But here's the good news. We still have time to turn this around. America is resilient. We've faced crises before, wars, financial collapses, recessions, and each time we've found a way to rebuild, innovate, and come out stronger. This time is no different, but it's going to take all of us being informed, prepared, and engaged. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll dig deeper into the practical steps you can take to navigate these uncertain times. Whether it's strategies for investing in a volatile market or understanding how to protect your retirement, I've got you covered.